Saskatoon. Grew up on a farm near Prince Albert and came here to study agriculture in 1968.
Excellent. What was the impetus for your interest in agriculture in general?
Just growing up on a farm, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you have? I know like Saint Barb talks about the first experiences he had in the trees and that galvanizing him. Did you ever have that?
In fact, I did. Yeah. The farm that I grew up on, my great uncle had settled on in about 1890. They'd actually moved from the McDowell area because the land they first took out was too sandy there by the forest reserve, and then of course the Rail Rebellion area was going on, so they moved to this, and he must have either transplanted trees or got them from the FRA. I'm not sure, but there was a beautiful spruce shelter belt on the north and west side of the property, and so planted in the 1890s. They were quite huge, like they reached 100 feet in about 10 years ago. And we used to play under those. I had a tree house built in it, and you could feel the sway of the trees. And then I had another little tree house near the house in an old maple that went on an angle. And even my dog Chippy could climb up there, and we could sit there. And then we had a third tree house farther away in between. So I love sitting in the trees and just watching the world go by and feeling the sway of the trees. And I love gardening more than the farm work because I felt I really did feel in my heart I could speak to plants, you know, and I was kind of experimenting with them, and they would respond. Yeah.
Excellent. What? How would you describe their response?
Well, just it was just kind of like you know, I want you to grow, I'm here for you to help you. Like I didn't hear back from them. It was just like that.
Hmm. Excellent. So it's sort of a two-way relationship in a way,
Yeah,
but non-verbal.
yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. So then, when did okay? So growing up on the farm, um, when did the transition into wanting to make it more of a career start?
Well, in agriculture, the first year is just sort of general. You take a sampling of all the different areas of agriculture, like animal science, agriculture economics, soil science, and so on. The first summer, I was hired on the soil survey crew, and so it was a good job because we traveled all around the province and we got travel expenses. And I did well in my studies, and I was considering going into crop science. So the second year, I got a job with plant breeding with cane agriculture, and so that was more to do with breeding canola. Canola wasn't yet a prominent crop on the prairies, and it was developing better varieties with lower uric acid. So um, it was good. But at the end of the summer, I decided that I wasn't that kind of focused enough for that kind of career. And at the fall, I was enrolled in a course with Stan Rowe, who was a professor of plant ecology. And plant ecology was a small sub-department within crop science. It was crop science and plant ecology. And he had a very holistic vision. And he took us out on field trips that fall to down in the river flats and east of Saskatoon and the Strawberry Hills and so on. And he kind of made the landscape come alive. Like he'd show us all the interrelationships and why on the south side you get more dry conditions and more grass and drought tolerant shrubs, and in the north side you get some aspen and in the coulees you get uh, bigger trees, and showed us why because of the distribution of heat and rainfall, and he was a well-known professor, outspoken professor about ecological issues. He had outspoken out against the Vietnam War, using Agent Orange to spray the forests in Vietnam, to which they used to help get expose the Viet Cong and things like that. So I was sort of becoming a little radicalized, and so I was attracted to him. And then in the fourth year, they offered a kind of for the first time, a very holistic course called Man in the Biosphere, which looked at the whole environmental problematique, if you like overpopulation, uh, overconsumption in the West, you know, how it's all fitting together. So I got a kind of a global picture of things, and that partly was fueled an earlier desire that I had to travel and kind of understand the world for myself.
Excellent. And when did St. Barb come into your life?
Well, in that last year, when I was studying Man in the Biosphere, like I said, Stan Rowe was one of the professors for that. And it was about January. It could have been the Christmas holidays. But you see, he got his honorary doctorate in the fall, in November 6th, 1971. And the university had a program where they used to interview uh, prominent scientists and so on. And I guess Stan Rowe had interviewed St. Barb. I call him St. Barb. That was what most of his friends called him. And so that was aired in early January. And I caught the program on a Sunday afternoon when I was at the farm. And I don't remember much of what was said, but you know, St. Barb was now in his 80s, and you know, he was wearing green. I remember that. And he's quite a tall person. He had this kind of Austrian forester's hat, and you know, he spoke very. He was a very strong speaker. You know, that's what came across to me. Like, this guy has got some charisma and energy. And but you know, I would have forgot about it, except in the spring I got this prize called Men of the Trees Prize, which he had set up when he was here. And it was to be for the person graduating in plant ecology, studying anything in forestry or closest to forestry. And so I was awarded that, and I actually got several scholarships. I did well in school. But the name intrigued me, like Richard St. Barb Baker Men of the Trees Prize. And so I got a address from the awards office and sent a letter. And in the letter I said I was thinking of traveling, and because I had relatives in England, I was thinking of going to England. And midsummer, I must have sent it probably early June. Yeah, probably in July sometime. I got the letter back, returned to sender, and I got a different address, and I resent it without opening it. And by November, I had decided I was going to be leaving and going to Australia. And so after I got to Australia, I heard from my mum. I could have been in New Zealand. I went to New Zealand first and then Australia. But I heard from my mum that he had phoned the farm and said, you know, that he wanted to get in touch with me and invite me to visit him in England when I came there. So I was very touched by that. And yet I still didn't go to the library to look him up, so I didn't really know anything about him, other than that I had this standing invitation for me when I got to London. I didn't know that he spent half the year in New Zealand, and I was actually very near his sheep ranch where his wife lives, but anyway.
So I wanted to jump in and ask, you talked about like the way he spoke, and David talked about that too, how he had a very he would rattle off these like sentences or phrases or whole paragraphs that they would just be off the top of his head, but they would be these, it's like he wrote it in advance or something. So I wanted to ask, like, did you have that experience, and if you did, how would you describe it, and overall, how would you describe his aura as a person?
Yeah, well, when I got to his door in Guildford, about an hour out of London, you know, like the way he greeted me with just such gusto and warmth, and you know, put his hand on my shoulder and come in, my dear boy, and it was just so endearing, and his hands were very firm and strong, and then when he spoke, yeah, like you said, he was a raconteur. He started telling me these stories. I mean, about crossing the Sahara Desert, and then he was learning Chinese because he wanted to go to China and cross the Gobi Desert, and maybe on horseback, you know, and it was like, how can a man have such, I mean, not only what he had done in his first 80 some years of his life, but what he still had another lifetime of plans, you know. And like, I had studied science in a way, like you look at a very small area of how this affects that, you don't look at the whole picture. All that class I took, was trying to get us to that. But he looked at the whole world, globally. He looked at, these are the issues we're facing. And yeah, he had these sort of standard lines, like the forest is a society of living things, the greatest of which is the tree, and then all of these interrelationships that happen in the forest, and how the forest has developed over eons and made life possible for human beings to live on Earth, and how this amazing trees, they built up this architecture and supply us with this abundance of wood, but all the other factors, like the forest is the mother of rivers. Sentences like that you'd never, poetic sentences that you'd never think of before. Like the forest store the water on the hillsides and absorb it like a sponge and keep the water cycle going, and that attracts cloud transpiration, and that affects the rainfall over an area. So trees attract rain, and so he had understanding of the global climate cycle way back then that nobody was talking about, and that the clearing of forests affected the eventual rainfall in the area and so on. So yeah, he just put things together in a global holistic vision and historical perspective as well.
So then, if someone were to walk up to you on the street and say, um, you know, describe to me Richard's I know it's really hard because his history is so vast and he's done so many things and been in so many places. Is there a way that you could kind of summarize it? Say like, generally what was his path through life?
Well, he followed his heart. He was inspired. I mean, you could say he was close to the collective unconscious, or his connection to God or the divine. He didn't talk about it much. He was very Edwardian, but he just, he had dreams and visions and inspiration that fueled his energy. He had this incredible enthusiasm and indefatigable energy, and he just, when I saw him, for instance, at the university, when he'd come to the president's office, and you'd have mail coming there for weeks and maybe months ahead, and then all of a sudden he'd be seconding the secretaries to help him reply to the mail, and everybody just felt like, well, this is the most important thing to do right now, is to help this man, because his mission is so strong, and I believe, like his mission is, you have to believe in it. It just makes total sense,
Yeah.
He just he would command attention.
Could you describe his travels? Where did he go? And what did he do?
Well, he came here, of course, first to Homestead. His uncle had come to Canada, and he'd heard stories about his uncle with bears, and his uncle was in Ontario. But Bishop Lloyd George, who was starting Emmanuel College here, was from England, and he went back to England. He was kind of a friend of the family. And so St. Barb heard him speak, and they were recruiting students to come and enroll in this new college. And the father wasn't sure how he was going to afford to pay for St. Barb's education, so this kind of worked out good. He could come here, get an education, and at the same time take out a homestead, and which he did. And St. Barb had a real affinity for nature as a child because his father had a tree nursery, so he had grown up watering trees and transplanting trees, grafting trees. He had bees from age 10. He loved horses, so here he was very resourceful. Like, so he would buy broncos and tame them for selling to people that needed horses for their buggies. And he wrote sports column for the local paper, and he had a little shack on campus. It was the early days. There was no rules, I suppose, at that stage, and you had to bunk some other students in it. And he spent time out at Beaver Creek, where his homestead was, and he'd spend time with the local Dakota, I guess, peoples there, and sit around the campfire with them. And he had a respect for them. He even though he grew up in this colonial era, he had a sense of affinity for people and their worldview, and because the view of nature of Indigenous people would really fit his own lived experience. Because as a child, he'd had this kind of ecstatic, mystical experience in the woods near his farm, where he just felt totally a kind of a cosmic opening to the beauty all around him. So his travels here, and then even while he was here, he traveled to Alberta. I know he had sort of a summer circuit for, he was studying divinity, so he'd go to do sermons on Sunday at different churches. And then he worked at a sawmill near Big River. He went down to Indian Head because the new tree nursery was opening there for farmers to supply trees for shelter belts. And to the research station farms for the university. And then when he got back to England, of course, it was World War I, and he was volunteered and he was sent to the front in France. And then he was wounded. He was then in Ireland, and he was the head of the Cavalry Division, helping people that had to learn how to ride horses. So he was training them. And he was wounded 3 times in the war. And then after the war, you know, again, his resourcefulness, he had this dream about airplane parts being turned into caravans. So he claims that he invented the modern trailer, a caravan, because he just saw that dream that night, and then he woke up in the morning, he saw an ad for surplus aircraft parts, and he got the train out there, and he was just thinking of getting a few parts to try and make a model. And then all of a sudden he said, well, this is the surplus. We only sell in lots of 36. So he just put the same price for 36 he was thinking for one. and he bought these big stacks of plywood and these undercarriage parts, and bought a few extra things just because they looked nice. And then the next week later he got a postcard. You've got them, and there's 10 truckloads of parts coming. And then he had to run around and find people's garages. Like he'd just think on the spot. But he came from inside. He had that dream and that inspiration. And so that was kind of way he financed his way through college. He got his forestry degree. Along the way, he'd helped set up the Forestry Commission in England. And because it was post-war, there was concern about the health of veterans coming back from the front, and that was the beginning of a need for a health department. And he was involved in that. He was very humanitarian in that way, and he set up a beekeeping club for people who had been wounded on the front, sort of as a hobby to help them. And so, but then he was sent to Kenya, and as assistant conservator of forests in Kenya in 1921, and he did quite a bit of travels around that area in Kenya as well. But his station, he covered quite a very large area. The area he was in charge of. But there again, one of the first things he did was befriend the local people, the tribe, the Kikuyu people, the Bantu people, and that same affinity for them. In fact, he was inducted into their secret society, and that's where this whole organization that he started called Men of the Trees began, because he could see that both their approach to agriculture, which was to clear a path in the forest, farm it for a couple of years till the soils are depleted, and then move on and start a new area, which is a traditional technique in the tropics, because the tropical soils don't have very much humus, and they don't last long without when they're exposed to the sun. And then, of course, he was giving timber permits for clearing of huge mahogany forests and so on. So he thought then, even back then, that this was going to be a danger. So that's when he enlisted these warriors, the warrior society, to become Men of the Trees. And he kind of adopted a bit of the Boy Scout idea, come together, have a camaraderie, had a sort of password, was Tohamwe, which meant pulled together. He had colors green and white, which were the colors of the University of Saskatchewan. Where you see their colors, they had a little badge with these colors. And then they had a motto, and then they had to do these 10 good deeds a year, and plant trees and look after trees everywhere. Do good deeds every day, plant 10 trees a year. Yeah. And so he offered a prize for the best outfitted warrior and their dance. He said they had a dance when they did anything, when the corn was planted, when the beans were planted. That was a tribal custom. He said, well, the only way I can get them involved, and he consulted with the elders, is if I use their local custom. And so he had a dance for the trees. So this was July 22nd, 1922. He held this dance, and he'll have a prize of a fatted bullock for the best warrior, and some necklace for the best dressed woman that came along. And so 3,000 warriors came to his surprise, and they inducted him into this secret society, which was kind of their modus operandi. So he was forever endeared to these peoples. But in fact, that endearment led a year later to the fact that one of his superiors was inspecting the workers, and he'd already seen the superior hit a worker with the blunt end of a riding crop, and he complained. And the next time he saw the superior on the same day go to do the same, he stepped in between and took the blow on his shoulder. So that was, in the colonial era, that was considered insubordination. He was dismissed, but it forever endeared him to the Kikiu. So he was sent packing back to London, and that gave him about a year back in London, where he started the Men of the Trees, chartered it as a formal organization. And then he used to speak and do other things, and so the Colonial Service became aware that this man, they had dismissed him, but he had applied again to be reinstated, and they reconsidered his thing. And so he also spoke at this conference on living religions in 1924, and he was presenting on asked to speak about African religions, and he spoke about the Kikuyu's belief about the great white spirit that lived in the great white mountain, and that's where the good came from, and they honored that, and his half-witted brother brought evil into the world, but they had to honor their hearts, basically. It was a heart-based tribal religion. So then he went sent to Nigeria the second time. He'd also encountered the Baha'i faith at this conference, and he really liked it because it's global perspective. So he took some Baha'i books from this woman he met. He went back to Nigeria, and he was there for 4 or 5 years. And again, he developed some very experimental approaches. Like the approach he developed in Kenya would be now called social forestry, like engaging the local people, not just coming in and we're going to plant trees, like endearing their involvement. And in Nigeria, he experimented with what we'd call agroforestry, where you plant some trees, and in between, while the trees are still developing, they need some shade, and you'd plant corn and other crops for a couple of years until the trees had developed big enough, and then they take off on their own. And he had a kind of a forestry school there. He traveled to northern Nigeria, and there he saw some of the sense of the encroaching desert from the Sahara, for his first-hand experience of that, and traveled around that area quite a bit. Even when he'd gone back from Kenya, he had taken the roundabout route going up across land to up down the Nile and up to Europe that way. So he was always adventurous that way, and but it was when he got malaria in 1929 and was sent back to England from Nigeria, and then the Chancellor of is it the Chancellor? It's an Englishwoman anyway was in charge of Palestine. Was then a protectorate of Britain, and so he was heard about St. Barb's work in Kenya and working in Palestine. He said that country needs trees, so he invited St. Barb to come to Palestine. And so St. Barb went to Palestine. His expenses were paid for, and he just had this extravagant idea to invite all the leaders of the different religions in that area to be part of this organization called Band of the Trees. And he was told this would never work because they don't speak to each other. And so he arranged this thing where he invited them individually, and said they were coming to this this big hall where they were going to meet.
Hello. Hi.
Okay.
I think I need a little drink.
Yeah.
Did
okay,
you
let's
bring some
cut.
water?
Oh no, we did not. I might